Using a sociological approach to analyze the Pharisees by Group 2. The Pharisees were an ancient Jewish sect that began to flourish in Palestine during the late Second Temple time period, 516 BCE through 70 CE. The word Pharisee is derived from the Hebrew Aramaic word parisha, which is translated as separated one. There were three primary Jewish sects in the time of Jesus: the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Pharisees. As their name precedes them, the Pharisees were, in fact, the most separated from the other sects because they were not associated with the foreign influences that were responsible for invading Judaism at the time. Who were the Pharisees? Pharisees means separated ones, mostly middle class and popular with the people, believed in the Word of God, the Old Testament, added many other man-made traditions to the Old Testament, and believed that these traditions were equal to the Word. They were proud of their self-righteousness and self-imposed rules, of their piety, appearing to be religious, and their desire to praise of men.
Hello everyone, my name is Lexi Alanis, and today I will be discussing more about the Pharisees just to give you a little more of an insight on who they were and what they believed in. The belief that was held by the Pharisees was that God gave Moses a law that was twofold: one, the written law, and two, the oral law. More simply put, they asserted that the people of Judaism faith should follow not only the conventional Jewish practices, but also the teachings of the prophets. The Pharisees also deemed it necessary for law to evolve, meaning that it was vital for men to apply reasoning when interpreting the Torah, and to also be able to apply it to modern challenges. In an instance when a law began to seem purposeless due to ever-changing conditions, the Pharisees would assign the law a new meaning and seek scriptural support for it. Furthermore, this ancient Jewish sect was able to harmonize their own ideologies with the teachings of the Torah through certain implications or suggestions in biblical scripture. Due to the Pharisees' progressive tendencies, their perspective and interpretation of the Torah continued to expand and still remains an existing force in modern Judaism today. Next, I will be analyzing the Pharisees through a psychological lens. A psychological experience is one that can be described to relate directly to the emotional and mental state of a person. Although there are a great deal of mental health disorders, narcissism is definitely the first that comes to mind when discussing the Pharisees. Narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, is a mental health disorder in which an individual has a grandiose sense of self-importance. These individuals are never pleased with the way others do things and base their standards on whatever they decide in that particular moment. The ultimate goal of someone who is suffering from NPD is remaining superior, and they are not concerned with achieving justice. As previously discussed, the Pharisees were generally known for their incessant need to construct laws according to their own ideologies and motives. An example that can be observed is in Matthew 23, 2-4. It says, "Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, 'The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all they tell you to do and observe, but do not according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them so much as a finger.'" In this instance, as well as many others, Jesus implies that the Pharisees are quite hypocritical due to the following reasons: the way they acted disingenuous in their pursuit to obtain the admiration of men, as well as how they took advantage of the vulnerable people who were not aware of their deceit. The Pharisees were responsible for misleading many people away from the true way in which biblical text is meant to be interpreted, in my opinion, and instead they guided them selfishly towards their own ulterior goals and motives. Now I'm going to pass it off to Leanne so she can tell you a bit more about the political standpoint in regards to the Pharisees.
examine the Pharisees from a political aspect, it's hard not to try and compare them to our current modern time political parties and think, well, maybe they weren't really a political party. And in that sense, they weren't exactly. They didn't have campaigns or do cross-country speaking events and hold elections. But when you do study and read about the ancient Pharisees, you do have to realize that they did have quite a bit of prominence, power, and influence in biblical times after what was called the Second Temple period in the ancient biblical times. The ancient Pharisees were in direct juxtaposition to the Sadducees insofar as their prominence and power. The Pharisee peoples were largely a movement made up of laymen who, unlike the aristocratic Sadducees, came mostly from lower and middle class peoples. This kind of made the Pharisees a lot like populists who strive to appeal to the ordinary peoples of the land. The Pharisees were also, or could also be considered, a type of social movement and a school of thought in terms of their beliefs and teachings. They were initially considered a religious party, not so much as a political one. However, over the course of many years, they did acquire a great deal of power and influence over their state and lands. They became the most popular party of the three Jewish sects of the time. The political power and strength they had revolved around the local synagogues, which they controlled for the most part, and their rabbis. The Pharisees themselves also were shown and noted historically to have had a great influence over Israelite society and some notable rulers of the time, including the Hasmonean queen Salome Alexandra and later Herod the Great. In the book written by Josephus, and Josephus, by the way, was a Jewish writer and historian, his book titled War and Antiquities of the Jews, he states his position regarding the Pharisees and the queen Salome Alexandra. The Pharisees were considered the real administrators of the state, at liberty to banish and to recall, to loose and to bind whom they would. In short, the enjoyments of royal authority were theirs. If Salome ruled the nation, the Pharisees ruled her. You can find in the book of Acts in the Bible, chapter 5, verses 34 and 23, 6 through 9, the Pharisees did serve on the high council of Sanhedrin and advised their high priest. A reading from the book of Mark in the Bible, chapters 23, verses 1 through 36, can give us a little bit of an insight and a moment of pause as we hear Jesus denounce the Pharisees and make claims against them that ring kind of familiar as similar complaints we have regarding our own politicians in today's modern society.
The Sabbath is a weekly, holy time of rest that both Jewish and Christian communities observe. Although both communities observe this time of rest, they have differences of traditions when it comes to this event. This time of rest was commanded by God to Moses, who in turn shared the commandments to the Israelites in Exodus 28 through 11. Both communities agree that this commandment is important, but because of the differences in teachings by Jesus and the Pharisees, rules and traditions during this time of rest look very different for both communities. Back during the Pharisees' time, they created a list called the 39 Malachot, which I think I'm pronouncing that right, which consisted of activities that are prohibited to do on the Sabbath because they are considered some type of work in the eyes of the Pharisees. However, these activities are not explicitly stated in the Hebrew Bible as prohibited, but the Pharisees added these rules and traditions to help people avoid breaking the commandment. However, as we see in the interactions of Jesus and the Pharisees in Mark 2, 23 through 27, the Pharisees would impose these rules and traditions as if they were law and confront any who broke these traditions or rules in an authoritative way. Although the original intentions of the Pharisees, one could argue, might have been to help the common people avoid breaking the commandments of God, they missed the point of the commandments, such as keeping the Sabbath holy, because they placed more power and were more insistent on the rules and traditions that they had set up, basically placing man-made rules over God's laws.
These prohibited activities and skills are included in the oral law of Judaism. Ancient rabbis put together a list of 39 general acts of work that were inherently prohibited to perform on the Sabbath. These were believed by Jewish teachers to have been given to Moses on Mount Sinai along with the written law. This includes the following. Interpreting written law. Rather than blindly following what is written as their law, whether it conflicted with logical reason or their conscience, the Pharisees put together what they had learned from the Torah with personal ritualistic beliefs and had redefined their collective ideas around these laws and practices. Through Jesus' miraculous practices and ministry, including healing on the Sabbath, he fulfilled specific prophecies proving that he was Israel's long-awaited Messiah. In verses 17 through 18 of Matthew chapter 5 of the King James Version, Jesus states, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say to you, till heaven and earth shall pass away, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled." Pharisees did not acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah because Jesus did not see their acknowledgement of oral law as binding as that which was written.
Hi, so I'm going to be talking about the Pharisees, and in particular the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector from an economic standpoint. So this is an interesting story to kind of review from that perspective, just because when you're looking at the two different groups that are associated with the story, the Pharisee and the tax collector, they're both predominantly economically well off in the society that they're living in. So in the parable, when both the Pharisee and the tax collector walk into the temple, the Pharisee particularly despises the tax collector for various economic reasons. The first one, it's more of a political reason, but the tax collectors work for the Roman Empire. And so this is a government that is particularly oppressive, and they collect money for this government. And it's just seen as, by the Pharisees, as being like almost a traitor in a sense, or as kind of going against almost the laws that the Pharisees have set in place for the rest of their societies to follow. And of course, this is seen as like the biggest kind of sin you can do to the Pharisees. So that's why the Pharisee isn't able to even look at the tax collector when they're both in the temple. Additionally, the tax collectors have this rep of collecting the money from the people that they needed to collect from, the rich and the poor, and asking a little bit more than what is needed for the government or to send back to the government, and keeping the rest. So economically, both the tax collectors and Pharisees were seen as being economically well off and not really like as a lower class. So it's interesting here that being from the same economic class, that the Pharisee would look down so harshly upon the tax collector. But then again, it's like this sense of being a traitor, of not pertaining to the same group, etc., etc. what I think is cool about this parable in particular is that there's not much contrast in the sense of like a really good person and a really bad person, or a really rich person and a really poor person. It's kind of like dealing with the rich and the richer, and kind of just acknowledging the fact that both of these people were sinners, but one acknowledges it and the other doesn't. So that kind of wraps up my economic perspective on the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Thank you, Dr. Adair, for being so supportive and productive during the semester. Have a great summer. Bye.
My section of this project/paper is over the anthropological perspective of the Pharisees. This perspective is a holistic study, meaning that it pertains to many different subtopics of study, such as biological anthropology, archaeology, linguistic anthropology, as well as other perspectives that have been mentioned in this paper, such as psychological perspective, political perspective, economic perspective, etc. Within the study of anthropology, there is a level of privilege because of the fact that there is discourse about the social structures, possibly the problems that other people face in their cultures, when the people that are discussing those problems don't have to face those directly, or they don't have to come in contact with the culture that they're discussing, especially if it's in an academic environment. And the Pharisees also have this same kind of privilege when writing the laws that their followers that are supposed to follow. Within my research, I would consider the culture of the Pharisees and the culture of the people that follow the laws of the Pharisees are very different, because the Pharisees are writing the laws for their followers, which they don't follow themselves. They consider themselves higher socially, morally, than those that follow their laws, and they expect to be treated with a higher level of class, a higher level of respect than those that follow their laws. Since they wrote the rules, they don't have to follow them. Since they're the ones that are the morally superior, quote-unquote, group of people, they don't have to follow the same rules that everyone else has to. Another aspect of the anthropological perspective of the Pharisees is symbols. A large part of understanding people's cultures is understanding their symbols, and not just like language symbols, but also like metaphorical symbols or religious symbols. And one of the symbols that Jesus uses to describe the Pharisee is the snake. The snake has been associated with the deceiver or the liars or the thieves, the worst of the worst, essentially, across the world, not just Christianity, across many different religions, across many different faiths, including Egyptian mythology. I mean, Apophis, the embodiment of chaos, is considered to be a giant serpent. Jesus describes the Pharisees as serpents because of the fact that they don't practice what they preach. Like I've said previously, they give other people laws to live by, but they don't do it themselves because they see themselves as superior than everyone else.